Chapter 16. The night before the solstice, love and promise. In the upper chamber, the hearth fire crackled softly, its trembling light gilding the curtains and the girl's hair. Outside, the wind from the fjord howled between the stone walls, and winter seemed to be listening beyond the window. Éliane sat on her bed, legs crossed, surrounded by her sisters. Siniag, the little terrier, lay on her back, snoring like an old kettle, her belly exposed and her paws twitching in her sleep. It was a picture of domestic peace, yet Éliane's heart did not share that calm. Tomorrow would bring her wedding. And with it, a future she had not chosen. He doesn't know me, she thought. And yet he defended me. The memory of the Highland man made her smile despite herself. She had seen him fight, not with rage but with measured strength, and the way his enemies had drawn back before him now seemed in hindsight something worthy of a ballad. "Why are you smiling like that?" asked Dunvalen the eldest, her tone skeptical. "You look like the cat that found the cream." Leora giggled, from the other side of the bed. "Look at her. She's like Siniag waiting for a treat." "I'm not smiling because of that," protested Éliane, blushing. "Then why, if we may know?" pressed Zan, the gentlest of them. "Tell us about the inn." Aveline sighed, with an air of moral severity. "A lady should never be seen in such a place." "It wasn't what you imagine," said Éliane softly. "It was uncomfortable, yes, and I was mortified when he asked me, in front of everyone, if I needed to go to the privy." Her sisters burst into muffled exclamations. Éliane covered her face, laughing and protesting at once. It wasn't his fault. He meant it kindly. "Oh, very gallant," Aveline said dryly. "And then what a fight." "Not exactly," said Éliane, recalling the moment with a spark in her eyes. "A man went at him, and fell before he could take 2 breaths. The others backed away." Leora leaned forward, fascinated. "Was there blood?" "No, little savage," said Zan, smiling. "But there was courage, wasn't there, Éliane?" "Yes," she said softly. "Courage and restraint." Aveline lifted her chin. "Is that what you want in a husband? A man who fights?" Éliane did not answer at once. She looked at the fire, where the embers were slowly turning to red dust. "I want a man who knows when to fight," she said at last, "and when not to." Zan nodded, pleased. "Then perhaps you found the right one." For a while the girls were silent, listening to the wind against the shutters. The night of Yule was drawing near. Soon the sun would reach its lowest point and the light would be reborn. Through the window, a fine snow had begun to fall over the fields. Aveline rose and held her hands toward the fire. "Whatever comes, tomorrow you'll be a wife. May the old gods and the new be kind to you." Leora, untouched by the gravity of the moment, was playing with the dog. "I like men who fight," she declared brightly. Zan laughed softly. "And you like stories, not men, at least not yet." Silence returned. In it, the north wind could be heard pressing against the glass. Éliane, her gaze lost in the flames, murmured, "He looks at me as if he truly sees me. Not as my father's daughter, nor as a promise of alliance." "Then, dearest," said Zan, taking her hand, "do not be afraid. That may well be the beginning of love." The flames sank lower, and the shadows slowly grew across the room. Outside, the solstice night was closing over the house like a cloak. Yule was near, and with it, the rekindling of fire and of hearts. Chapter 17. Yule dawn, December 24th. Dawn rose with a pale light over the rooftops of the village. The mist, thick as an ancient breath, drifted down from the river and curled around the ankles of the early risers. In that newborn gray, the men and women of the market moved as if within a dream only beginning to wake. Rowan walked among them, wrapped in his cloak. With every step, the air smelled of brine and damp coal. It was his wedding day, though he could scarcely believe it. The hours leaned toward noon, and with it would come the bells, the guests, and the sealed alliances. Yet within his chest still beat something of the wanderer he had been, a man made for the wind more than for walls. The market stalls offered cloth, oat bread, jars of honey, carved knives. Rowan stopped before a woman selling silks and velvets. Among them was a green fabric deep as tourmaline, shot through with threads of gold that glimmered beneath the frost. He thought of Éliane's eyes, and bought it without haggling more than courtesy required. Not out of vanity, but from the awkward desire to offer something beautiful to a life still strange to him. Later he purchased a silver brooch, old and of uncertain origin. The stone set at its center, a pale chrysolite, held the inner light of something that had survived both time and sea. He tucked it carefully away, unaware that this object born of an island of serpents and legends would bind his fate more deeply than any vow. When the sun broke through the mist, the fjord awoke. The masts of ships rose like spears against the pearly sky, and gulls traced circles above the slow waters of the Miren. Rowan followed the path to the pier, drawn by the shimmer of the river. The air was so clear the cold stung to breathe. It was then he saw her. A solitary figure, wrapped in a dark cloak, watched the ships with a stillness almost devout. There was something familiar in her, the straight posture, the bare neck, the way the wind played with a loose strand of hair. Éliane. The ground was slick with ice, and when Rowan turned in surprise he slipped. The motion carried him against the pilings of the dock, and the noise made the young woman start and turn. In an instant both lost their footing, she trying to steady him, he trying not to pull her down. The result was inevitable. A splash of freezing water and two fates plunged into the grey river Miren. The cold cut through them like a blade. Éliane surfaced first, gasping, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her cloak clinging to her shoulders. A white feather loosed from a gull drifted down and landed on her nose. Rowan, drenched and stunned, couldn't help but laugh briefly. "Are you mocking me?" she asked, shivering. "Only the feather," he replied softly. The tension dissolved into a wintry silence. A sailor, witness to their accident, threw them a rope. Éliane, driven more by her fear of river eels than by her betrothed's words, scrambled from the water in a splash. The man led them to a small cabin where a brazier burned. There, in the faint warmth of the fire, Rowan offered her his cloak and a bowl of hot ale. Éliane, still trembling, murmured a word of thanks. In the steam rising from the cup, color returned to her cheeks, and her gaze, still clouded with emotion, rested on him with a mixture of surprise and trust. It was then that the sailor introduced himself as Cormac of Clan MacDarren, sent by Rowan's sister to offer them the ship Miren as a wedding gift. The news, unexpected, seemed to seal the moment with a hint of omen. When they were alone, Rowan asked, half reproachful, half tender, "What were you doing here so early, Éliane?" She lowered her eyes. "I wanted to see the ships. I've heard of them since I was a child, but I was never allowed near." He said nothing. The fire crackled, and outside the river kept its course beneath a sky slowly brightening. In that instant they both understood, without saying it, that the water had joined them before men or vows ever could. And that, like the river flowing toward the sea, their fate would remain to move forward, together or apart, into the unknown. The day of Yule dawned over Dunvalen, and the solstice light drew a golden path across the Miren. Chapter 18. The Yule gift, the fire kept by the ancients. Morning rose with a pale glow over the fjord. Frost clothed the trees, and the air, so still it seemed to hold an ancient prayer, smelled of peat smoke and salt. Éliane walked beside Rowan along the riverbank, while the ships on the Miren slept beneath a translucent mist. They spoke little. The quiet between them was new, almost shy, yet not uncomfortable. Since the accident at the pier, something had loosened between them, as if the cold water had stripped away their masks. Rowan watched her with a faint smile, and his eyes, wintry blue, caught a flicker of light. Éliane noticed, and found herself smiling too without knowing why. Her heart felt light, freed from the formality and decorum that usually bound her. For the first time she felt at ease in the presence of that man. A stranger, yes, but one who seemed to understand her without words. The silence of the river surrounded them. There was in the air an undefinable sense of expectation, as if the day, the last before Yule, held a meaning it had not yet dared to reveal. He stopped. "Éliane," he said softly, "I want to give you something." He reached inside his cloak and drew out a small leather case. Éliane took it, surprised by the warmth it still carried from his body. Inside, on a piece of linen, rested a golden brooch, its rubies and sapphires gleaming like embers and ice in the light. "It belongs to my family," he explained. "I found it years ago, when I still believed rivers could keep secrets." She looked at him, and for a moment she thought she saw in his eyes the same uncertainty that lived in hers, the longing for something pure, the hope that the other might believe in their promise. Éliane lifted her gaze to the sky, where the pale sun was beginning to dissolve the mist. "They say Yule gifts are for beginnings," she whispered. "And for promises," he added. Their hands brushed. It lasted no more than an instant, yet it was enough to drive away the cold. The blood in both of them, still trembling, recognized in that touch something words could not name. Then Rowan bent his head. There was no haste, no urgency. Their lips met lightly, like a breath awakening a flame without consuming it. Éliane felt the world grow still, the murmur of the river, the crunch of frost beneath her boots, the distant chime of Dunvalen's bells. Everything seemed to pause, as though winter itself were holding its breath. When they parted, she smiled, not with innocence, but with a new understanding of the world and of herself. Rowan fastened the brooch at her cloak's collar, and the gold, warm from his touch, seemed to pulse once against her skin. "Now it's yours," he said. "And whatever comes, it will be too." The mist began to rise. Over the water the solstice sun drew a golden path, and Éliane thought that perhaps winter was not an ending, but a door. Chapter 19. The Yule Reliquary. The wind from the fjord still battered the windows, as they took refuge in the small guardroom beside the pier. The coals in the hearth burned lazily, and the air smelled of tar and salt. Outside, men were finishing the preparations for their return to the manor of Valen. The horses snorted, and the murmur of water against the pilings echoed the urgency of the tide. There, in that brief shelter between the river and the storm, Éliane and Rowan waited for Captain Cormac's signal, while the swinging lamp cast over them the golden flicker of a portent. Éliane held in her hands a golden brooch, so old and heavy it seemed to contain its own light. Rubies and sapphires, red as fire, blue as the winter night, shimmered beneath the glow. "I've never seen anything so beautiful," she murmured. Rowan watched her. That jewel was never meant to be there. It belonged to his family, and should have remained locked away, just as his sister had insisted. But seeing it in Éliane's fingers, he knew he could never take it back. There was a story about the relic. Many years ago, a little girl had found it on the shore of a lake where a boy, her brother, had fallen. She later said the brooch had shone upon the water, guiding her to him. Since then, people said the piece always found its way to the one who needed it most. Rowan was not a man of superstition, yet something in Éliane's gaze, in her wonder, in her innocent faith, made him think that perhaps destiny was merely what the ancients called kindness. A knock at the door drew him from his thoughts. Captain Cormac appeared in the doorway. "My lord, the hour draws near. The escort is ready." Silence returned, heavier than before. Rowan looked at Éliane. Her hair, still damp, fell over her shoulders, and in her green eyes glimmered a flicker of expectation. "You've lost your hat," he said. "It must have fallen into the river," she replied with a resigned smile. Rowan unfastened the cloak from his shoulder, and held it out to her. "Take it. The fjord wind will be cruel by dusk." "And you?" she asked with a gentle concern that disarmed him. "Won't you be cold?" He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I won't feel it." She drew the cloak over her head, and the brooch, brushing the fabric, gleamed for an instant, as if recognizing its fate. Outside, the Yule bells began to ring. The shortest day of the year carried with it the beginning of something no winter could extinguish. Chapter 20. Yule Eve in the afternoon. The room was filled with the murmur of preparation. Between the tapestry-covered walls, steam from the bath veiled the furniture, while outside the snow struck the windows with a soft, persistent rhythm. Éliane, submerged in the warm, herb-scented water, tried to contain the restlessness beating in her chest. In less than an hour she would be a wife. Around her, the maids moved with nervous efficiency. Clarisse kept the fire burning and refilled the cup of wine resting by her side. Leora gathered the ribbons scattered on the floor, while the echo of women's voices filled the air like a domestic choir. Éliane's mother, Lady Dunvalen, commanded that small army with the poise of someone who had lived through many seasons and still feared the consequences of youth. Her sisters, Zan and Aveline, had taken refuge beside the large wooden tub, seeking the warmth of the fire. Zan, always the most cautious, watched Éliane with a tremor of curiosity. "Are you afraid?" she asked at last, barely above a whisper. Éliane lifted her gaze. In her green eyes danced a mixture of dizziness and pride. "No," she replied softly. "Although, my heart runs faster than the current of the Miren." There was a pause. The young women exchanged glances, unable to hide their unease about the mysteries of marriage. The air seemed thicker, laden with steam and omens. "He treats you kindly, doesn't he?" Aveline asked in a low voice. "With respect," Éliane murmured, avoiding her sister's eyes. "And something more than that." Before she could add another word, Lady Dunvalen's voice broke through from the center of the room. "Girls, enough of this chatter. There are moments that call for reflection, not talk." Silence fell at once. Obediently, Éliane stepped out of the water. The cold air wrapped around her, and Clarisse hurried to cover her with a heavy wool robe lined with silk. The young woman moved toward the table where she had left a small chest. She opened it and drew out the brooch Rowan had given her that very morning, an ancient jewel of gold and sapphires, its gleam seeming to hold a secret. She held it between her fingers, thoughtful. "It's a gift," she said. "He said it has belonged to his family for generations." Lady Dunvalen stopped short. "Gold? And you accepted it?" "Yes, mother." Éliane raised her face calmly. "He said it brings good fortune to whoever wears it on the day of Yule." Her mother sighed. For a moment her sternness broke, and her expression took on an old, almost superstitious foreboding. "Yule brings fortune or warning. Do not forget that, my daughter." Éliane bowed her head, and as the cold chain of the brooch touched her skin, a shiver ran down her spine. Outside, the wind from the fjord rose again, and the distant chime of the manor's bells announced that the day was moving on. The time of maidens was drawing to an end. Soon the time of wives would begin. Chapter 21. The Groom and the Winter. In the high chamber of Valene, the fire burned with a weary glow, casting shadows that danced upon the stone walls. Outside, the wind from the fjord blew with a long, mournful wail, as if to remind men of their frailty before winter. Rowan had just returned. His cloak still carried the scent of the river, and the smoke of torches. Upon entering, he found his companions waiting with that blend of curiosity and camaraderie that often precedes great events. "Is the wedding still on?" asked Éliane, closing the door behind him. "As far as I know, yes," Rowan replied, removing his cloak and letting it fall over a chair by the hearth. The other gave a short laugh. "The hall is in turmoil. They say you brought the bride half frozen, and the cook threatens to quit. Valet swears he won't light another fire, not even if the king himself begs him." Lucan, more serious, added, "And you, as always, have forgotten to eat." Rowan barely smiled. "Appetite can wait." On the bed lay a parcel that had arrived that afternoon. When he unwrapped it, the twilight's light caught a fold of golden velvet, embroidered with threads fine as hair. "A gift," he explained without lifting his gaze. Éliane leaned over the fabric. "Did you buy a girl or an heiress?" Rowan ignored him. He drew from his belt a small silver brooch, and the green gleam of its stone shimmered in the smoke-laden air. "This will do," he said simply. The men exchanged glances. Lucan, the eldest, sighed. Poor creature, the bride. She's said to have a talent for trouble. Not without my help, Rowan admitted. Then, almost reluctantly, he recounted what had happened at the dock. The accident, the icy water, the borrowed tunic. When he finished, silence settled among the three, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the patter of rain against the glass. "And did you kiss her?" asked Éliane, unable to suppress a grin. Rowan nodded slowly. "Yes. I kissed her." None of them laughed. Something in his tone, deeper than the confession itself, restrained them. Later, when the servants entered with the bath and the steaming buckets, the two men withdrew without pressing further. Rowan remained alone. The water restored warmth to his body, but did not dispel the unrest of his spirit. In that silence, he felt again Éliane's lips, the trembling pressure of her hands upon his chest. There was something in her, a blend of innocence and fire, that unsettled him, almost sacred in its strangeness. The wind slipped through the crack of the window, and a flake of snow settled on the rim of the tub. The day was fading, and Yule was drawing near. Soon winter would bind him to his wife. And with her perhaps to his fate. Chapter 22. The eve of the wedding. The echo of footsteps rang against the stone floor of the corridor as Éliane burst into the chamber, Lucan close behind. Both wore on their faces that mix of humor and urgency that precedes great moments. "Rise, future husband," announced Éliane, setting a flask on the table. "You wouldn't want the bride to think you've changed your mind." Lucan raised his cup with a smile. "Or at least, not more unease than she's already endured." Rowan, still dressing by the fire, cast them a tired look. The steam from the bath still floated in the air like a stubborn mist. Éliane picked up the folded tunic from the bed and examined it with mock gravity. "White? Not bad. Though I'd say blue suits you better." "Since when do you know anything about fashion?" retorted Lucan, pushing him aside. Without the mood for jokes, Rowan stood and with a sharp gesture chose the dark blue tunic. The golden embroidery gleamed like a thread of sunlight amid the shadows. Over his shoulders he placed a mail shirt and, tightening his belt, adjusted his sword. The pommel with its amber topaz shone briefly in the light. "You'll make her proud," Lucan said quietly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I'm glad to have you both at my side," Rowan replied, and there was a tone in his voice that neither of them wished to break with a jest. They left together, crossing the hallway that descended toward the east wing where the family awaited. The air smelled of wax and fresh branches. The servants had hung garlands of holly and yew intertwined with white ribbons, while the chill from outside slipped through the cracks of the old wall. The priest waited in the chapel's doorway beneath the stone arch. His round face radiated the calm of one who had seen many weddings and few miracles. "At last, my lord," he said jovially. "I was wondering which of your father's daughters would be the first to marry." Rowan inclined his head politely. "I won't say it was easy to choose." The priest laughed, pleased with his own wit. But Rowan barely heard him. A noise, half laughter, half shrieks, was rising from the west wing. It was the family, making their way with the lively commotion of a great house on a wedding day. A gray, imperious cat curled around the groom's leg, demanding attention. Rowan gently nudged it aside with his foot just as she appeared. Éliane. She entered on her father's arm, wrapped in a green gown of brocade and velvet that seemed to draw its color from winter itself, the green of holly, of moss beneath frost. Her black hair fell in ordered curls, and upon her chest gleamed the brooch, the same relic he had hesitated to give her. Rowan felt the air grow denser. Something in her step, wavering yet determined, stirred a pang of doubt within him. Did she truly wish for this union? When at last they stopped before the altar, Éliane lifted her face. The smile she offered him was as sweet as Yule wine and as uncertain as firelight on ice. The priest began to speak, but Éliane, who had crept forward quietly, leaned toward Lucan and murmured with barely contained mockery, "By all the saints, the bride is drunk." Rowan didn't hear it. Or if he did, he mistook it for the whisper of wind slipping through the stained glass. Outside, the snow had begun to fall in a silence that felt ancient. The day of Yule was drawing near, and with it the certainty that no fire, not even love's, could burn without a trace of shadow. Chapter 23. The Omen of the Grey Cat. Rowan watched her with a mixture of tenderness and confusion. Éliane's eyes shone too brightly, and the uncertain curve of her smile seemed born not from the memory of their kiss at sea, but from a wine too generously poured. She took his arm with a gesture meant to be playful. "Bonjour, Rowan," she murmured, as if French were a charm against cold or shame. The Dunvalen family gathered behind her, splendid in silks and velvets that gleamed like exotic birds against a winter landscape. Lord Dunvalen met the groom's gaze with stiffness. It was not a welcome but a warning. Lady Dunvalen, on the other hand, looked away, her restless fingers tangling in her daughter's veil. For an instant, Rowan thought he glimpsed something like doubt. Were they regretting this marriage? But Éliane laughed, and her laughter, soft and a little clumsy, dissolved the thought. The bride's sisters stepped forward, the two eldest, their astonishment veiled beneath ceremonial smiles. The youngest, Lysander, burst between them with the lightness of one who does not yet know the weight of years. In her arms she carried a white puppy, who, sensing the stir of the moment, escaped her grasp and darted barking through the chapel. The next instant became a small domestic tragedy, a sharp shriek, the bellow of a cat, and a sudden flame that climbed up Rowan's leg. He shouted, pushed Éliane aside by reflex, and looking down found the culprit, the Grey Castle cat, tangled in the folds of his tartan, seeking desperate refuge from the furious terrier. The chaos was brief, but memorable. The cat in its flight scrambled up the groom's arm, shredding cloth and patience alike, until it reached his shoulder where it hissed with defiance. The terrier leapt at his feet, barking like a spirit from the underworld. He wore a coarse woolen liney belted at the waist, and the dark plaid fell in folds over his legs like the skirt of a warrior. He wore no trousers, but that strange and virile garment the Highland men considered the pride of their kind. With all the composure he could muster, Rowan led the cat out of the hall, released it into the courtyard, and returned with dignified steps, though his leg burned beneath the filed moor. The entire family held its breath. The priest, blushing, bit his lip. Éliane and Lucan barely contained their laughter. Lady Dunvalen sank into her husband's arms, while the sisters fanned the air as if they could sweep away the family's shame. Lysander, the youngest, gathered her dog and scolded her with solemn authority. "Syniac bad, one does not chase cats during Mass." Silence returned gradually. Rowan, with a strained smile, resumed his place beside the altar. The cold air seeping through the stained glass stung his wounds, yet he did not move. The priest raised his gaze, and his voice rang solemnly through the stone vault. "Is there any among you who knows a reason why Lady Éliane de Valenne and Sir Rowan MacAvain should not be joined as husband and wife?" No one replied. Only the wind, slipping through the windows, seemed to murmur something in a tongue older than Gaelic. Chapter 24. The solstice banquet, when two worlds touch. Éliane leaned gently on her husband's arm. At the entrance of the chapel Rowan had seemed solemn, almost distant, yet the memory of his voice, of his gentleness that morning, still burned sweetly in her chest. Perhaps it was the wine, one cup or maybe two, that made the air feel warmer and the lights more golden. The banquet stretched beneath the beams of the great hall like an offering to winter. Strings of ivy, tall candles, and crimson ribbons adorned the walls. The scent of bread and roasted meat mingled with the resinous perfume of pine branches. Outside, the wind moaned between the battlements, but within, the joy of Yule burned like an ancient fire. Acrobats and jugglers danced among the tables, drawing laughter and cheers. A fire-eater sent a flame up toward the vaulted ceiling, and for an instant the shadows seemed to come alive on the walls, as if the old spirits of the forest had gathered to witness the feast. Éliane watched spellbound. Everything seemed beautiful, and a little unreal. Her cup, which she could have sworn was full, was empty again. She gestured to a servant, and wine once more stained the glass a dark red. The steam from the dishes rose in swirls that dampened her cheeks. She tasted the fish covered in a sauce of herbs and cream, and for a moment she thought of her mother, her discreet, watchful presence, and she served herself vegetables as she used to at home. The thought moved her without knowing why. Rowan's arm brushed hers. He smiled at her with that calm that seemed to belong to another life, and Éliane's heart grew still. "You are beautiful tonight, you truly are," he murmured, barely audible. She lowered her gaze, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks. Her husband's eyes were a deep blue, and his hair falling across his brow caught the glow of the fire. "We will have beautiful children," she thought, and the thought felt as simple and true as the air she breathed. Around them the noise of the hall continued, the echo of laughter, the crackle of logs, the murmur of wine being poured, but everything blurred slowly, as if the whole world hung suspended between one breath and the next. It was the longest night of the year, and somewhere beyond the stone walls the sun waited for its return. Chapter 25. The Yule toast, where the old gods still sigh. Lord Dunvalen rose from his seat, the silver cup held high. "1,000 welcomes to my new son by marriage. May heaven grant you long life and peace." A murmur of laughter escaped from the younger daughters, but the master of the house silenced them with a single stern glance. "And may you grow old together," he added, "in kindness and in fortune." Rowan stood as well, tall and straight, the firelight tinting his armor amber. "The honor is mine, my lord. I swear to guard your daughter with the same devotion with which I would guard your name." The old man seemed satisfied, and sat down again while the murmur of cups filled the hall. Outside, the wind swirled against the windows like a chorus of ancient spirits. Éliane, the most reckless of friends, rose with a solemn air and the unsteady gait of one who had drunk more than was wise. "May the days ahead bring you children and health. And may the warmth of your hearth never fade." Lady Dunvalen drew a sharp breath, her veils trembled like the wings of a wounded bird. "Sit down," Rowan muttered under his breath. "You're alarming my mother-in-law." Éliane obeyed, though with a mischievous smile. "She believes," he whispered, "that you compromised her daughter this morning." The wine went up Rowan's nose. "What are you saying?" "I did no such thing." "Aveline told me," said Éliane, glancing toward the youngest of the sisters, who whispered at the far end of the hall, bright and noisy as a flock of starlings in a winter tree. Rowan wiped his chin, suppressing a curse. "I kissed her, yes," he said at last, his voice low. "And that's no cause for scandal." Éliane raised an eyebrow. "Perhaps not for you. But tell me, does her mother think the same?" Rowan turned his gaze toward Éliane. The girl was laughing, radiant under the lights, her face flushed with wine and happiness. She had drunk more than she'd eaten, and he watched her for a moment, torn between tenderness and concern. Then Éliane clapped her hands, her rings chiming softly. "I have a gift for you, Rowan," she said with a smile meant to be seductive, though a tiny hiccup betrayed her. The hall burst into restrained laughter. She stood, unsteady, yet when she spoke again her voice was clear and sure, as if the spirit of Yule itself had descended upon her. "Listen," she whispered, "for it is a song for our longest night." And when Éliane began to sing, the noise of the hall faded, one sound at a time, as though every flame leaned in to listen. The melody was ancient, older than the language in which it was sung, and within its trembling lay the promise of the light that would return with the dawn. The Song of Éliane. When Éliane sang at her wedding, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. It was not the voice of an obedient maiden, nor that of a performer seeking applause. It was a voice that came from farther away, from the waters that had seen her grow, from the wind of the fjord, from a lineage of women who sang to remember who they were. Her song held no ornament, yet it carried a purity that pierced stone cold and hearts alike. Conversations fell silent one by one, even the torches seemed to bow. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the very soul of Valen had awakened to listen. Rowan, who had lived among mountains and storms, felt for the first time the presence of the sea within himself. That song disarmed him, not with sweetness but with truth. He had heard songs of war, of harvest, of funerals, but this one was different. It was the sound of the world before words. They say whales sing to keep the memory of the oceans alive, and that their voices travel farther than light. So too did Éliane's song pass through the stone walls of the hall, the towers, the snow-capped hills, until it vanished into the Yule night. It was more than music. It was a vibration that reminded the heart of what it had forgotten. In that moment all understood without thought, that love, like music, cannot be explained. It can only be recognized. It can only be heard with the oldest part of the soul. And when her voice faded, the silence that followed was not emptiness but fullness. The echo of the song lingered between their bodies, as if the earth itself had breathed with them. Thus Éliane, the greatest of the singers of Chiron's hollow, offered her true gift, to remind humankind that music is the way the earth says, "I love you." Chapter 26. Yule Night, the love that conquered darkness. Éliane's voice rose like a thread of gold in the air. She recited an ancient song of the clans, a prayer woven of love and fate, that heart which my heart holds in such grace, that of two hearts we may make one alone. Her tone, calm and steady, seemed to awaken in the stones of the hall an old echo, as though the generations of the past were listening from the shadows. When she fell silent, no one spoke for a long moment. The cups remained still, and even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Then Rowan stood and with reverent grace took her hand and kissed it. "May our lives be as pure and strong as this song," he said, looking into her eyes. Then without another word, he kissed her before them all. It was a long, resolute kiss that sealed the bond between their houses. The guests roared with joy, striking the stone floor as the torches trembled in their iron rings. Amid laughter and blessings, Rowan lifted his bride into his arms. Éliane rested against his shoulder, smiling with the abandon of wine and joy. Thus they crossed the hall, climbing toward the upper wing of the house, where the air smelled of wax and freshly cut pine. The bridal chamber was prepared for a ceremony older than marriage itself. Green fir branches formed arches above the bed, white silk hung like frost, and the candles, dozens of them, cast a light that seemed to breathe. Rowan set her down, and warmth wrapped around him at once. For an instant, the silence was so deep he could hear the beat of his own heart. Éliane gazed at him with a drowsy tenderness, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted as if still whispering the song from the feast. "I love being your wife," she murmured. He smiled, moved, though he sensed something strange in her voice, the innocence of sleep rather than the awareness of desire. When he finally tucked her beneath the sheets, she had already closed her eyes. Rowan stood for a long while, watching the fire crackle in the hearth. Outside, the wind swept through the valleys with a winter's moan, and the forest answered with its deep murmur. It was the night of Yule, the longest of the year, when the world seems to hold its breath before the rebirth of light. And the young husband understood suddenly that the true mystery of their union did not lie in the body, but in the silence that surrounded them, as deep and ancient as the earth itself. A song for the sun's return. Rowan did not extinguish all the candles. He left a few burning, as if their trembling light were witness to the vow they were about to seal. The golden glow shimmered on the folds of Éliane's gown, on the silk of the sheets, and in the uncertain gleam of her eyes. He leaned over her and, before saying a word, kissed her forehead. A simple, almost reverent gesture. Yet in that brief touch lay all the tenderness of a man who knew what it meant to win and to lose. "This night is yours," he murmured, his voice low and unsteady, "and mine if you wish it so." Éliane nodded, unable to speak. The air between them grew dense, sacred. Outside, the wind from the fjord howled against the shutters, as if the old gods were reminding them of their watch. He brushed her hair aside, with a slowness that felt ceremonial. Every motion seemed to carry a vow. His hands, warm and steady, moved with a reverence that spoke of restraint rather than possession. He looked at her as one might behold something fragile and eternal at once. "Do not be afraid," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "We will learn together." Their closeness became a conversation without words. The warmth of the fire mingled with the rhythm of their breathing. Time itself seemed to wane. What passed between them was not conquest but communion, a quiet surrender, deep and unhurried. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters. One candle flickered out, leaving the room bathed in amber light. In that half-shadow beneath the longest night of the year, their fate was sealed, not in fire or passion alone, but in the calm recognition that love, like Yule, is not taken by force. It is kindled, honored, and endured. Epilogue. Dawn over Valen Manor. Two hearts in the same dawn. Dawn arrived with a silence so pure it seemed newly born. Mist rose slowly over the fjord, in silver threads carried by the wind toward the hills of Trotternish. The song of a blackbird echoed among the ancient stones, and the first light of day filtered through the shutters, painting the room in pale gold. Éliane opened her eyes, and for a moment she did not remember where she was. The haze of sleep still surrounded her, warm and perfumed with his scent. The fire had burned low, but the embers still glowed, just like the warmth lingering between their bodies. Rowan slept beside her, lying face down, one arm stretched across the rumpled sheet, his dark hair falling over his brow. She had never seen him like this, without the plaid or the liney, without the weight of duty or the hardness of command. Only a man. Her husband. She watched him for a long time, as if she wanted to etch every detail into her memory, the line of his jaw, the slight curve of his lips, the shadow of his beard brushing his neck. His breathing was deep, steady, and Éliane felt something within her expand slowly, like the sun rising through the mist. Not only desire. Not only tenderness. It was belonging. Carefully, she sat up. The sheets slid over her bare skin, and the cold air made her shiver. She wrapped herself in a blanket, and walked to the window. The Miren fjord stretched beyond, veiled in mist, and the echo of the sea reached her like an ancient prayer. Everything looked the same as the day before, and yet nothing was. "Where are you going so early, Mo Critty?" Rowan's voice was rough, still heavy with sleep. She turned. He was half upright, looking at her with that blend of calm and fire only he could summon. Éliane smiled. "To watch the sun rise over our lands." "Then don't go alone." He rose, wrapped the blanket around them both, and drew her to his chest. The warmth of his body surrounded her, and the roughness of his beard brushed softly against her temple. For a moment they stood in silence, watching as the sky turned pink and amber above the water. The wind carried the distant sound of a bagpipe, perhaps a shepherd greeting the dawn from the hills. Éliane rested her head on his chest and felt his heart steady and strong. "Do you regret it?" he whispered. "Not a thing," she replied without hesitation. "Not one word. Not one kiss." Rowan smiled, and that smile was warmer than the sunrise. "Then let this day be our first beginning, not only as Laird's son and wife, but as two souls who have at last found each other." Éliane lifted her gaze, and in his eyes she saw the whole landscape reflected, the sea, the sky, the promise of something new. The first ray of sunlight reached them then, bathing their faces in golden light. And in that moment, as day broke over the Highlands, she knew that whatever would come, war, uncertainty, life itself, she could face it because she had him. The wind whispered through the stones, and the echo of the sea replied. Valen awoke. And with it their love. On the way to Thornbrae Castle, between winter and eternity. The sea stretched out like a plain of lead beneath the winter sky. The waves struck the hull with a deep, almost ritual cadence, while the northern wind swelled the sails of the Miren. Éliane clung to her husband's arm. The voyage to the Highlands had been long, and the storm that caught them off Mull had left the deck drenched, the air heavy with salt and silence. Rowan stood beside Captain Cormac, his gaze fixed on the horizon with the gravity of a man returning to the place of his birth. "We're near Loch Erin," announced Cormac, pointing westward, where a line of mountains emerged through the mist. The scent of wet heather and peat came with the wind. Éliane breathed it in deeply, sensing that this wild, unfamiliar fragrance carried something of home within it. In the distance a dog barked, a sound lost among the gusts, and she thought she heard the echo of some ancient omen, as if the mountains themselves were greeting the return of their son. Rowan took her hand. "There lies Thornbrae," he said quietly. "Between those hills." You'll see the smoke from the chimneys when the sun rises. The ship turned slowly into a narrow fjord, where the water grew dark and deep. Snow from the previous night blanketed the slopes, and at last the castle appeared, rising from a grey rock, its towers defying the overcast sky. The lights of the great hall flickered like embers in the dusk. On the shore, figures wrapped in cloaks awaited them. As they drew near, Éliane distinguished a tall man with a graying beard and a woman with a serene face. When the boat touched land, Rowan leapt ashore and offered his hand to his wife. "Father." "Mother," he murmured, bowing his head. Callum MacAvayan gripped his son's shoulders with restrained emotion. "Welcome home, my son," he said in a deep voice. "And you, lass," he added, turning to Éliane, "we welcome you as a daughter of the clan and lady of this valley." The woman, her eyes clear as the lake, embraced Éliane warmly and in silence. "We have waited long for this day," she whispered. "May winter bring you joy, and may Yule find you beneath this roof." Éliane lifted her gaze toward the castle. The torches burned along the wall, and the sound of the fjord's waters striking the rock mingled with the distant tolling of a bell. She felt something ancient, long dormant in her blood, awaken at the touch of that land. The wind rose, carrying the scent of woodsmoke and snow. Rowan took her hand once more, and together they climbed the path toward the doors of the great hall, where the hearth fire awaited them. Yule had begun, and with it, the promise of a new lineage beneath the mountains of Scotland. The silence of the Highlands. Silence is not emptiness in the Highlands. There every stone breathes, every snowflake carries a message. Silence is an ancient tongue that only the heart understands. At times, Éliane feels that the whole world has stilled its pulse to listen to something unspoken. It comes from the fjord, from the wind that brushes the castle towers, from the frost-covered firs. It is the same silence she heard as a child when she closed her eyes and longed to understand the soul of the sea. Now, in the winter of her destiny, she recognizes it, not as absence but as presence in its purest form. Rowan has learned to dwell within that silence. The men of his land have little need for words. Their truth is spoken through the eyes, the gesture, the way they place a hand upon another's shoulder. He knows that silence holds more promises than any oath, and that by the hearth, a shared breath can be a covenant as sacred as a prayer. Between them, a soundless understanding is woven, a subtle vibration, like the song of whales beneath the ocean, a music unheard yet felt deep within the bones. Each meeting of their eyes is a syllable of that invisible language. Each gesture, a word of light. In the Highlands, silence does not divide, it unites. It is the bridge between the human and the eternal, between body and soul. The wind speaks it over the moors, the waters of the Miren echo it in their deep course. And when the snow falls, the world seems to remember its origin, a time when words did not yet exist and all was understood through presence alone. Thus at Yule, when the night is longest and the earth seems to sleep, Éliane and Rowan learn what the ancients once knew, that true love does not need to be spoken. Only heard. Only lived. The end. Author's note. There are winters that arrive not only with snow, but with silence. That silence is not absence but memory, the ancient murmur of the earth that still remembers the footsteps of those who loved it, defended it, or dreamed it. In that realm suspended between life and myth, this story was born. Yule in the Highlands is my way of honoring that sacred stillness. I wanted to write about the moment when the world seems to pause, when darkness reaches its deepest point and yet already heralds the light to come. In the calendar of the ancients, that moment was called Yule, the rebirth of the sun, the promise of return, the certainty that even the longest night carries a pulse of hope. Éliane and Rowan were born from that stillness. She, a daughter of the south, raised within the walls of order and reason. He, a man of the north, forged by wind and the secret fire of the clans. Their union is not merely a marriage, it is the symbolic gesture of a world seeking to reconcile the human and the wild, the learned and the ancestral. Around them the landscape, the sleeping mountains, the frozen fjord, the lights flickering in the distance, is not mere scenery but another character, a spirit that listens, that holds, that teaches. In the Highlands, everything has a soul: the ice, the stones, the wind that whistles through the cracks. There, silence speaks and song answers. Because I also wanted to write about that, the power of sound and of silence. Éliane sings at her wedding, and for an instant the entire castle stands still. Her voice does not belong only to a woman in love, but to the memory of the earth itself. Within it echo the old songs of Yule, the chants that once lit the hearths when the sun seemed lost. In that voice lies the true miracle of this story, not love as overflowing passion, but love as vibration, as fire beneath the snow, as the echo that reminds us who we are. Perhaps that is why this novel does not seek to be exact but true. No chronology matters as much as the tremor of what still endures, faith in the light, the beauty of simplicity, the hope renewed with every winter. Yule, after all, is not a date but a symbol, the instant when the soul, like the earth, rekindles. To those who listen beyond words, to those who recognize the language of silence, to those who still believe that love can awaken spring amid the ice, I offer this story. May you feel upon closing the book, as I did while writing it, that something very ancient and very much alive is still singing beneath the snow. With gratitude and wonder. Anya, Lysander.